In the summer of 2019, a 22-year-old fire lookout named Liam Caldwell, known for his sharp eyes and love for the wilderness, vanished from his isolated steel tower on Devil's Peak in the heart of the Klamath National Forest. For 6 years, the official story was a sad but simple one, a tragic accident in an unforgiving landscape. Then, a university dive team testing new sonar equipment at the bottom of a remote reservoir found something that didn't belong in the cold, dark water. A discovery that would prove Liam's disappearance was no accident at all. A phone vibrated on a desk, its harsh buzz cutting through the silence of a modern apartment. On a large monitor nearby, the complex lines of a digital map glowed. For Chloe Caldwell, a cartographer who spent her days turning the messy chaos of the world into neat, logical lines, any call from an unknown 530 area code was a disruption. It was the number for Northern California, the region that had taken her brother 6 years ago and never given him back. For the first few years, a call like this would have sent a jolt of impossible hope through her. Now, it was just a scar of dread. She answered, her voice practiced and neutral. "This is Chloe." "Am I speaking with Chloe Caldwell?" The voice on the other end was male, measured, and carried a weight of officialdom. "Yes, this is she," Chloe said, her grip tightening on the edge of her desk. "Miss Caldwell, my name is Detective Harding with the Siskiyou County Sheriff's Office. I'm calling you today regarding the case file of your brother, Liam Caldwell, from 2019. The police hadn't called in years. The case was inactive, a cold file buried in an archive." "Yes, I'm his sister. What about the case?" "There has been a development, Miss Caldwell. Yesterday afternoon, an item of interest connected to the case was recovered." The word recovered hung in the air, clinical and strange. It wasn't the word you used for something that was simply found, it was the word you used for something that was taken from where it shouldn't be. Chloe pushed her chair back, her legs suddenly unsteady. "An item? What kind of item? Where was it recovered?" She heard the faint rustle of paper on the other end of the line. The item was located at the bottom of Iron Gate Reservoir. A team from Stanford's geology department was on site testing new submersible sonar equipment. Their instruments registered a non-geological anomaly at a depth of approximately 150 feet. Chloe's eyes shot to the massive map that covered her living room wall. It was her 6-year obsession, a detailed topographical map of the Klamath National Forest, covered in a constellation of colored pins. Red for the official search zones, yellow for the volunteer efforts. Her gaze scanned the map, her mind instantly visualizing the location the detective had named. Iron Gate Reservoir. It was miles from Devil's Peak. It was nowhere near any of the red or yellow pins. It made absolutely no sense. "What did they find?" she asked again, her voice stronger now. "You have to tell me what it was." "Miss Caldwell, I understand your need for information. However, for the integrity of the now active investigation, we can't discuss the specifics of the evidence over the phone. We are going to need you to come to our office in Eureka to make a formal identification." Eureka. The name itself was a ghost, the town where hope had gone to die. But this was different. This was evidence. "It was his binoculars," Chloe said, the words coming out before she could stop them. The thought was so sudden, so certain, it felt like a memory of her brother's proud, smiling face on their last video call. The detective was silent for a long moment. "That is one of the items we need you to identify." "Yes," he confirmed. "But the reason we've reclassified this as a potential homicide investigation is not just what we found, but how we found it. The dive team's report indicates the object was deliberately weighted down." Weighted down. The phrase landed like a punch. Fires didn't weigh things down. Accidents didn't weigh things down. People did. People who had something to hide. In that single moment, the entire narrative of her grief shifted. "I'll be there tomorrow morning," she said, her voice devoid of the tremor it held just minutes before. She ended the call and stood in the quiet of her apartment. For 6 years, The map on her wall had been a story of loss. Now it was a crime scene. She walked over to it, her finger tracing the thin blue line that represented Iron Gate Reservoir. The first real clue to her brother's fate hadn't been found in the dirt or ash of the forest he loved. It had been pulled from the cold, dark water, 40 miles from where anyone had ever thought to look, and with that clue came a new, terrifying question that replaced the old one. It was no longer just what happened to Liam. It was, who did this to him? The 7-hour drive north was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. Chloe drove on autopilot, the hum of the tires on the asphalt a monotonous soundtrack to the reel of memories playing in her mind. The familiar urban sprawl of her city slowly gave way to rolling golden hills, which in turn yielded to the dense dark green forests and the looming shadow of the mountains ahead. She remembered this drive from 6 years ago, a frantic, tear-filled rush toward a mystery. Now, the journey was different. It was quiet, deliberate, and heavy with a dread that was somehow worse than the frantic panic of the past. Hope was a more dangerous thing than despair. She arrived in Eureka as the afternoon sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the small mountain town. It looked exactly the same, frozen in time. She saw the same diner where she and her parents had forced down silent meals, the same motel with its flickering vacancy sign where she'd cried herself to sleep. Each landmark was a small, sharp poke to a bruise that had never fully healed. The Siskiyou County Sheriff's Office was a low, unassuming brick building, but to Chloe, it felt as imposing as a fortress. She parked her car, took a deep breath to steady her hands, and walked inside. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of stale coffee and paper. A deputy at a glass window directed her to a small waiting area. A few minutes later, a tall man with tired eyes and graying temples emerged from a hallway. "Miss Caldwell? I'm Detective Harding," he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm and professional. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. I know this isn't easy." He led her down a long, sterile corridor painted a pale, institutional green. The silence was broken only by the squeak of their shoes on the linoleum floor. They entered a small, windowless room furnished with nothing more than a metal table and 3 chairs. An evidence box sat in the center of the table. Chloe's eyes were immediately drawn to it. Her heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. "Please have a seat," Detective Harding said, gesturing to one of the chairs. He sat opposite her, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't open the box right away. Instead, he opened a file folder he'd carried in with him. "Before we begin," he said, his voice even, "I want to walk you through the recovery. The item was located yesterday at approximately 14:30 hours by a Stanford University marine geology team. They were mapping the floor of Iron Gate Reservoir with a new side-scan sonar array. They registered a metallic object in a sector of the lakebed not known for debris at a depth of 147 feet. He slid a grainy black-and-white sonar image across the table. It showed a vague, oblong shape against the murky bottom. "They sent down a remotely operated vehicle to investigate," he continued. "The ROV's camera confirmed the object was not geological. A dive team was dispatched this morning for recovery." He finally turned his attention to the box. "The chain of custody has been maintained since it was brought to the surface." He carefully cut the evidence tape and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in protective foam, was a pair of binoculars. They were caked in dried mud and algae, the metal parts corroded, the rubber armor scarred and peeling, but there was no mistaking them. They were Liam's Vortex Vipers. Chloe felt the air leave her lungs in a silent rush. It was one thing to hear it on the phone, it was another to see them, to see this ghost from the past lying on a table in front of her. "Miss Caldwell," the detective said softly, "can you confirm if you recognize these?" Chloe couldn't speak. She just nodded, her eyes fixed on a colorful woven strap still attached to one side. It was faded and water-stained, but she could still make out the pattern she had braided herself as a good-luck charm. "The strap," she finally managed to say, her voice hoarse. "I made that for him." Detective Harding nodded slowly. The serial number also matches the one from the original missing persons report. There's no doubt these belong to your brother. He paused, letting the finality of the moment sink in. The divers also recovered this. He reached into the box again and placed a small, clear evidence bag on the table. Inside was a piece of frayed, weathered rope, tied around a heavy, jagged piece of granite the size of a brick. "This was tied around the binoculars," he said. "This is why we've reclassified the case. This wasn't an accident, Miss Caldwell. Your brother didn't drop these. Someone took them, drove them 40 miles to the reservoir, and threw them in the deepest part they could find, ensuring they would never surface." Chloe stared at the rock. Such a simple, brutal thing. A tool to hide a crime. "Who?" she whispered. Detective Harding leaned forward, his expression shifting from sympathetic to serious. "That's what I need to talk to you about. We have a primary person of interest. In reviewing the original case files, we found numerous interviews regarding another seasonal lookout, a man named David Miller. The name was familiar, of course. David had been a shadow in the background of Liam's stories that summer, the grumpy older guy who thought he deserved the better post. The original investigators documented a significant altercation between your brother and Mr. Miller just 2 days before Liam's last known contact," Harding continued, reading from a report. "According to witness statements from other park employees, Miller accused your brother of kissing up to management to get the Devil's Peak assignment. The argument became heated. Miller allegedly told your brother to watch his back out there alone." A memory hit Chloe, sharp and unwanted. Summer sun filtering through tall pine trees, the scent of dust and sap. David's face red with anger, jabbing a finger toward Liam. "It's not right," David's voice muttered in her memory, low and venomous. "Some of us work for years for a post like that." "Miller allegedly told your brother to watch his back out there alone." The detective's voice pulled her back to the present. "They were just words," Chloe said, shaking her head, trying to push the memory away. "Liam told me David was all talk." "Perhaps," the detective conceded, "but Miller had the means, the motive, and the opportunity. His post was only a few miles from your brother's. He had access to the same service roads. He had a documented history of a temper. And most importantly, when we tried to re-interview him a month into the initial investigation, he had quit his job and disappeared. His last known address was a rental in Oregon. He was gone." The pieces fit. It was a neat, simple, and horrifying story. Jealousy, an argument, a flash of rage in a lonely place, a terrible act, followed by a panicked cover-up. It made a sick kind of sense. Just as she was trying to process this, the door to the interview room opened. Ranger Jenkins stood there, her face etched with concern. She looked older than Chloe remembered, the 6 years having carved new lines of worry into her features. "Detective, sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice soft. "I was at the station and heard Chloe was here. I wanted to see if she was all right." "Of course, Sarah, come in," Harding said, standing up. Ranger Jenkins pulled a chair over and placed a comforting hand on Chloe's arm. "Honey, I'm so sorry," she said, her eyes full of genuine sympathy. "When I heard what they found, and where they found it—" "He thinks it was David," Chloe said numbly. The ranger's gaze shifted to the detective, then back to Chloe. She let out a long, heavy sigh. "I never wanted to believe it could be him," she said, her voice filled with regret. "But I can't say I'm surprised. David, he had a dark side. I had to write him up twice that summer for insubordination. He was deeply jealous of Liam. Your brother was bright, capable, and everyone liked him. David resented that. I remember that argument they had. It was worse than what the report says. I had to personally break it up." Hearing it from Ranger Jenkins, the woman who had been a pillar of strength during the search, made the theory feel solid, real. If she believed it, how could Chloe not? An hour later, Chloe walked out of the sheriff's office into the cool evening air. The detective had given her a thick binder filled with copies from the original case file, including interviews and photos. He'd promised to keep her updated as they launched a national search for David Miller. She had an answer. She had a name. She had a face to put to her family's nightmare. She checked into the same motel from 6 years ago, the room just as faded and lonely as she remembered. She didn't turn on the television. Instead, she spread the contents of the binder across the worn bedspread. There were photos of the search teams, pictures of the empty lookout tower, and a grainy photo of David Miller, squinting into the sun with a defiant look on his face. This was him, the man who had thrown her brother's future into a lake. It was a simple story of jealousy and rage. It was the story the police believed. It was the story a trusted park ranger had just confirmed. It should have been enough, but as Chloe stared at the grainy photo, a small, quiet voice deep inside her whispered that it was all wrong. It felt too simple, too neat. She looked over the reports again, the timelines, the witness statements. It all pointed to David, every single piece, and that was the problem. It was too perfect. It felt like a story someone had written, not one that had actually happened. The police had given her a killer. So why did she have the chilling feeling that the real monster was still out there, hidden somewhere on the vast, sprawling map of the forest she thought she knew? The motel room was quiet, but Chloe's mind was roaring. The binder of case files lay open on the worn bedspread, a 6-year-old story told in the flat, detached language of police reports. For hours she read. She absorbed every detail, every statement, every photograph. The police had built their case against David Miller brick by brick. It was a neat package, tied with a bow of motive and opportunity. There was the official report on his public argument with Liam, detailing threats that seemed more serious on paper than they had in memory. There were interviews with other workers who called David a loner with a short fuse, a man who simmered with a quiet resentment. The story was simple, logical, and clean, and Chloe didn't believe a word of it. The neatness of it all felt wrong, like a perfectly assembled puzzle with a piece that had been brutally forced into place. Her eyes kept returning to a crime scene photograph of the interior of Liam's lookout tower, taken the day after he was reported missing. It was clean, orderly, too orderly. Liam had been passionate and dedicated, but he was not a neat person. He was the kind of person who left books open to mark his page, who left coffee mugs on railings, who spread his maps out like a general planning a campaign. This picture showed a room that felt sterile, as if it had been wiped clean of any personality, any sign that her vibrant, messy brother had ever lived there. She flipped to the official inventory list attached to the report. Every item assigned to the tower by the Park Service was present and accounted for. Nothing was missing. Nothing was out of place. That, more than anything, felt impossible. A memory surfaced, emerging from the fog of grief with sudden, sharp clarity. It was from the summer before Liam took the lookout job, when they were at their parents' old house, packing things away. Liam had pulled her into his childhood bedroom, a conspiratorial grin on his face. He'd knelt down and lifted a loose floorboard under his desk, revealing a small hidden space beneath. "Every good hideout needs a secret stash," he'd told her, showing her his treasures. A first-edition comic book, a pocket knife from their grandfather, and a small, leather-bound journal. He'd carried that habit with him everywhere. He loved secrets, hidden pockets, and clever hiding spots. Chloe looked at the picture of the clean, orderly tower, and a new thought sparked, a tiny, determined flame in the darkness. What if he had a secret stash in the rental house? The police had searched it once, briefly, and then sealed it. Chloe still had the key on an old keyring in a junk drawer at home. She had kept it for 6 years, a small, useless piece of metal that was her last physical link to the life Liam had been building. Now it didn't feel useless at all. It felt like the only thing that mattered. The next morning, Chloe stood on the porch of the small, dusty rental house on a quiet street in Eureka. The air was still and smelled of dry pine needles and old memories. The key felt cold in her hand as she slid it into the lock. It resisted for a moment, stiff from years of disuse, then turned with a heavy, grating click. The door swung open, releasing a wave of stale, trapped air. The house was a time capsule. A coffee mug sat on the kitchen counter, a thin film of dust coating the brown ring at the bottom. A hiking magazine lay open on the small sofa, its pages slightly yellowed. It was as if Liam had just stepped out for a moment 6 years ago and would be back any second. The feeling made Chloe's throat tighten. She pushed it down. She wasn't here for memories. She was here for answers. She went straight to his bedroom. It was sparse, containing only a bed stripped of its linens, a cheap wooden dresser, and a small desk. She did a quick, thorough search first. She checked under the bed, ran her hands along the back of the dresser, and looked in the empty closet. Nothing. She knelt down and began pressing every floorboard, listening for the telltale hollow sound of a hidden space. The floor was solid. Frustrated, she sat on the edge of the dusty mattress, her gaze falling on a cardboard box in the corner. It was half tucked into the closet, easy to miss. On the side, written in Liam's familiar messy scrawl, was a single word: maps. Her heart gave a little jump. Of course, if Liam had a secret, he wouldn't hide it in the floorboards like a little kid. He'd hide it in plain sight, tucked away in the one thing no one else would ever bother to look through carefully. She lifted the box onto the bed. It was heavier than she expected, full of rolled-up topographical maps, trail guides from the Park Service, and several star charts for identifying constellations. She carefully unrolled each one, her fingers leaving clean trails in the fine layer of dust. Near the bottom of the box, she found it. It was a map of the Devil's Peak region, but it was different from the official Park Service ones. It was hand-drawn on thick, high-quality paper. Liam had added his own notes in the margins with a fine-tipped pen, little symbols for where he'd seen a family of deer, notes on which creeks were running dry, and markings for the best spots to watch the sunset. This was his personal map, his secret map. A surge of adrenaline shot through her. She quickly rolled the map back up, tucked it under her arm, and left the house, locking the door behind her. Back in the stale air of her motel room, Chloe spread the two key documents side by side on the floor. On her left, the official computer-drawn search map from the police binder. On her right, Liam's hand-drawn map from the box. Her heart pounded as she began to compare them. Her finger, the same one she used to trace contours on a screen, now traced the search grids from the official map, cross-referencing them with the terrain on Liam's. The official search, led by the expert Ranger Jenkins, had been extensive. The neat, color-coded squares covered miles of wilderness in every direction from the lookout tower. They covered the main trails, the secondary trails, the creeks, the ridges. On paper, it looked like a comprehensive professional search. It looked like they had searched everywhere. But they hadn't. Chloe's finger stopped, hovering over the paper. There was a hole. A blank spot on the official map, a small, unnerving island of untouched wilderness surrounded by the colored squares of the search grid. It was a rugged, isolated area of steep rock walls and heavy tree cover. On the map, it was labeled Echo Canyon. Her eyes darted to Liam's map, to the exact same location. He had circled Echo Canyon with a bright red pencil, and next to the circle, in his messy but excited handwriting, was a note that made Chloe's blood run cold. Echo Canyon, cool rocks, go back next week. The two maps told two different, warring stories. The police story was that Liam had disappeared somewhere within the massive searched area. But Liam's own map told her he had found a new interesting spot, a spot outside that area. A spot he was planning to return to right before he vanished. This wasn't a mistake. Chloe, a cartographer, knew a mistake when she saw one. This was a deliberate omission. The hole in the official map was too clean, too precise. Someone had designed the search to actively avoid that canyon. The face of Ranger Jenkins flashed in Chloe's mind. The calm, reassuring woman who knew the forest better than anyone. The woman who had designed the search grids herself. She would have known about Echo Canyon. Why would she keep her teams away from it, especially if it was a place Liam was interested in? Chloe stood up, the motel room feeling suddenly cold and small. The official story, the one about the jealous co-worker, shattered into a million pieces. David Miller had a temper, but he didn't run the search. He didn't draw the maps. Ranger Jenkins did. The kind, helpful ranger who had hugged her and offered her sympathy. The woman who had confirmed that David was a problem employee, subtly nudging the investigation in his direction. Was it all an act? Had she been pointing the police toward David to keep them from looking somewhere else? To keep them from looking in Echo Canyon? Chloe knew, with a certainty that terrified her, that she could not go to Detective Harding with this. A theory based on a handwritten note and a blank spot on a map. He would think she was a grieving sister, lost in paranoia and conspiracies. He trusted Ranger Jenkins. Everyone in town did. Right now, in this cheap motel room, Chloe was the only person in the world who knew the map was a lie. She walked to the window and looked out at the distant, dark silhouette of the mountains. The police were hunting a ghost named David Miller, but Chloe knew the real answers were waiting in a place that had been deliberately, carefully kept off the map. She turned back to the room, her decision made. She carefully folded Liam's hand-drawn map and slid it into her backpack. She grabbed her keys. She was going to Echo Canyon. The next morning, the air was crisp and cold when Chloe left the motel, long before the sun had climbed over the distant mountains. She didn't drive toward the main entrance of the Klamath National Forest, with its friendly welcome sign and bustling ranger station. Instead, guided by a network of old logging roads on one of Liam's maps, she found a remote, unofficial trailhead, a simple dirt pullout half hidden by overgrown manzanita bushes. She checked her phone, no signal. She was on her own. The thought should have been terrifying, but instead it felt clarifying. Out here, there were no police theories, no well-meaning but suspicious rangers. There was only the forest, the map, and a question that needed an answer. She pulled on her backpack, locked her car, and stepped into the immense, silent woods. The hike to Echo Canyon was not like any she had taken before. There was no trail to follow, only the coordinates from Liam's map and her own intuition. She moved through dense undergrowth, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds sang, no squirrels chattered. The only sound was the crunch of her boots on dry leaves and the pounding of her own heart. She felt a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the feeling of being watched. She told herself it was just paranoia, but she couldn't shake the image of Ranger Jenkins's face, the way her kind eyes seemed to hold a deep, hidden knowledge. After nearly 2 hours of difficult hiking, navigating by compass and the contours of the land, she found it. The entrance to the canyon was a narrow split between two massive granite boulders, almost perfectly concealed by shadows and brush. It was a place you would never find unless you knew exactly where to look. Chloe took a deep breath and squeezed through the opening. The world inside was different. The air was cooler, the light dimmer. The tall, steep walls of the canyon muffled all sound, creating a strange, cathedral-like silence. It was beautiful and deeply unsettling. This was the hole on the map. This was the secret. She was standing in a place the official search had never touched. Now came the next question. The canyon was real, but was there any proof that Liam had actually been here? She began to search, moving with a methodical focus that pushed her fear into the background. She walked the length of the canyon floor, her eyes scanning every rock, every crevice, every shadow. She found nothing but rocks and hardy, shade-loving plants. A flicker of doubt entered her mind. What if she was wrong? What if this was just a wild goose chase born from grief? She was about to turn back when she saw it, tucked under a rocky overhang, almost invisible against the dark stone, was a small cave. It wasn't deep, more like a large hollow scooped out of the rock face. The entrance was partially obscured by a fallen dead tree. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She scrambled over the rocks, pulled the dead branches aside, and peered into the darkness. She switched on her flashlight, the bright beam cutting through the gloom. The beam landed on a small dark green shape in the back corner, covered by a dusty gray tarp. She crawled inside the tight space, the smell of dust and dry earth filling her nose. With a trembling hand she reached out and pulled back the tarp. It was Liam's backpack. The faded patch from his favorite band was still sewn onto the front. He was here. The relief was so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. This was proof. The official story was wrong, but relief was quickly replaced by a new, more urgent question. The backpack proved he was in the canyon, but what did it tell her about what happened to him? She pulled the backpack out into the pale light of the canyon and unzipped the main compartment. Her hands shook as she pulled out the contents one by one. A half-eaten bag of beef jerky, a nearly full water bottle, a small, well-used first aid kit. These were the mundane artifacts of a life cut short, and seeing them made the loss feel fresh and raw all over again. Then, at the bottom of the pack, she found a small, leather-bound notebook. Liam's journal. She sank to the ground, her back against the cold wall of the cave, and opened it. The first several pages were filled with his observations about the forest. Notes on animal tracks, sketches of cloud formations, thoughts on the profound silence of his job. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning for the final entries. She found it near the end. The writing was dated July 15th, 2019, the day before he disappeared. The entry was short, the handwriting a little rushed. Ranger Jenkins saw me exploring the canyon today. She got really angry, which was weird. She said this place was off limits, but she wouldn't tell me why. She looked scared. I think there's something she's hiding here. Chloe read the words once, then twice. The air in her lungs turned to ice. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Ranger Jenkins, the trusted helper, the calm authority, the woman who had hugged her and promised to find her brother. She hadn't just missed this place. She had kept people away from it. She had lied. She had pointed the police toward David, knowing he was a dead end. The question was no longer just what happened to Liam. It was what secret was Ranger Jenkins hiding in this canyon that was worth killing for. Just as that terrifying thought crystallized in her mind, she heard a sound. Snap! It was the sharp, clean sound of a twig breaking just outside the cave. Chloe's head shot up. Her blood went cold. She wasn't alone. She scrambled backward into the shadows of the cave, clutching the journal to her chest, trying to silence the sound of her own ragged breathing. Slowly, a figure appeared at the mouth of the cave, a dark silhouette blocking the pale light. It was Ranger Jenkins. The ranger's kind, sympathetic smile was gone. Her eyes, which had always seemed so full of warmth, were now as cold and hard as the canyon walls. She looked at the backpack on the ground, then at the journal clutched in Chloe's hands, and finally at Chloe's terrified face. "I knew you were smart," Ranger Jenkins said, her voice low and chillingly calm. "Just like your brother was." Chloe stared at Ranger Jenkins, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The kind face she remembered from the police station was gone, replaced by a cold, hard mask of determination. The cave, which had felt like a discovery just moments before, now felt like a tomb. There was only one way out, and the ranger was blocking it. "You were a good searcher," the ranger said, her voice quiet, almost a whisper, but it carried through the small space with chilling authority. "Too good. You should have left it alone, Chloe. You should have believed the story we all worked so hard to write." "You're the one," Chloe whispered, pushing herself further back against the cold stone wall. "You lied. You knew where Liam was this whole time." Ranger Jenkins took a slow step into the cave, her shadow falling over Chloe. "Your brother didn't understand," she said. "This place, this canyon is special. He was a trespasser. He wasn't supposed to be here." Chloe's eyes darted around the cave, desperately searching for an escape, for a weapon, for anything. Her gaze landed on Liam's green backpack lying on the dusty ground beside her. She saw the shoulder strap, and on it, something small and bright orange. Liam's emergency whistle. He never went hiking without it. "A whistle is louder than a scream," he had always told her. As Ranger Jenkins took another step forward, her hand reaching out, Chloe moved. She didn't run. She dove. She lunged for the backpack, her fingers fumbling for the plastic whistle. Before the ranger could grab her, Chloe had it to her lips. She inhaled deeply and blew with all the air in her lungs. A deafening, high-pitched shriek filled the small cave, so loud it felt like it was splitting her skull open. It echoed off the rock walls, a piercing scream of plastic and air. Fweet! The ranger recoiled, her hands flying to her ears, her face contorted in surprise and pain. That single moment of hesitation was all Chloe needed. She scrambled past the stunned woman, out of the darkness of the cave and into the pale gray light of the canyon. She ran. Her feet slipped and slid on the loose rocks of the canyon floor as she sprinted away from the cave. She didn't dare look back. She could hear the ranger shouting her name, the sound warped and strange by the canyon's echo. She raced down the narrow passage until she hit a dead end, a sheer cliff that dropped 100 feet to the trees below. She was trapped again. Panting, she turned. Ranger Jenkins was walking toward her, no longer rushing. The fight seemed to have left her, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. "That whistle won't help you," the ranger said, her voice heavy. "No one ever comes here. I made sure of that." "Why?" Chloe cried, her voice raw. "Why would you do all of this?" The ranger stopped a few feet away, her gaze drifting out over the vast expanse of the forest. For the first time, Chloe saw tears welling in the woman's tired eyes. "My son, my own boy, Daniel. He died here," she said, her voice cracking. "He was only 14, a hiking accident, years before you and your brother ever came to this forest. He fell from that very cliff you're standing on, this canyon. It became his place, his memorial. It was my secret, the only place in the world I felt close to him. It was supposed to be quiet. It was supposed to be sacred." She turned her eyes back to Chloe, and they were filled with a terrible, pleading anguish. "Then your brother found it. He was so full of life, so loud, so excited about his discovery. He didn't understand. He didn't see a memorial. He saw cool rocks. He was a trespasser on the most sacred ground I have. I told him to leave," she continued. "I told him it was a protected ecological area and that he was forbidden from coming back. I begged him to tell no one about this place. But he was stubborn, just like you. He argued with me. He said the forest belonged to everyone. He said he was going to report me for trying to keep a part of a national park to myself." The ranger's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "We were right there at the edge. We were yelling. I didn't mean to. I pushed him. I just wanted him to go away, to leave my son's memory alone." Her voice broke into a sob. "But he stumbled. He lost his footing. He tried to grab onto me, but it was too late. He fell. It was an accident. A terrible, terrible accident that happened because I was so angry." Chloe stood frozen, listening in horror as the 6-year-old mystery unraveled in a torrent of grief and confession. "I panicked," Jenkins whispered. "I couldn't let them find him here. I couldn't let them turn this place into a crime scene, crawling with police and news crews. This was Daniel's place. So I hid him. I used all my knowledge of the forest to make it look like an accident somewhere else. I threw his binoculars in the reservoir, miles away, knowing it would send the search in the completely wrong direction. I made up the story about the flash fire. I did it all, just to keep this canyon quiet." Just as she finished speaking, a new voice cut through the air, sharp and official. "Ranger Jenkins, this is the Siskiyou County Sheriff's Office. Step away from her with your hands in the air." At the entrance to the canyon stood Detective Harding and 2 uniformed officers, their weapons drawn. Chloe's heart leaped. The whistle had worked. A lone hiker on a ridge miles away had heard the repeating distress signal through his binoculars, recognized it, and called it in on a satellite phone. Ranger Jenkins did not run. She did not fight. A look of profound relief washed over her face, as if a weight she had been carrying for 6 years had finally been lifted. She slowly raised her hands and let the officers lead her away. "We found Liam," Detective Harding told Chloe later, after they had guided her safely out of the canyon. He was where she said he would be. I am so sorry, Chloe. We should have listened to you." Months later, after the trials had ended and the news stories had faded, Chloe drove back to the Klamath National Forest one last time. She drove up the winding road to Devil's Peak and climbed the steel steps of the lookout tower. The room was empty, swept clean, waiting for a new season and a new lookout. She walked to the window, the same one where Liam had sat for his last video call. In her hands, she held his binoculars. The police had cleaned them, and the scratches on the lenses were like tiny scars telling a long, sad story. She lifted them to her eyes and looked out at the endless green forest. It didn't look like a monster anymore. It was just a forest. It hadn't taken her brother. A person filled with a terrible secret sadness had. The villain wasn't the wilderness. It was the grief it held. Chloe lowered the binoculars, a single quiet tear tracing a path down her cheek. It wasn't the happy ending she had dreamed of for 6 years, but it was an ending. It was the truth. After a long, dark journey, she had finally brought her brother's story into the light. And in the profound silence of the empty lookout tower, she felt him and herself finally at peace.